The story is that someone is wandering the cemetery at night in French fashions, a high-class lady, a beautiful lady, and when people see her, she throws up her hands, she screams, and she disappears. And the idea is that she might be reliving the night of her death.
Today on Crawlspace, we speak with return guest Bess Lovejoy, and she tells us all about the Lone Fir Cemetery in Oregon, among many other things. Lance, what'd you think of this conversation?
I love having Bess back on, and we're entering into the spooky season, and there's really no better guest than I can think of to sort of kick it off for us than Bess Lovejoy. She is a prolific writer. You can check out everything that she's done on her website, besslovejoy.wordpress.com. The link is in the show notes. And I just love the direction this conversation goes in. We even touch a little bit about the benefits of hot dogs.
Good. Well, I hope all of our listeners enjoy it as well. And big thanks to Bess for joining us. And you can follow Bess on Instagram at Bess Lovejoy. And while you're out there, please follow us on social media at Crawlspace Podcast or Crawlspace Pod.
All right, we're going to break real quick for commercial, and we will return with Bess Lovejoy and the stories of Lone Fir Cemetery.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program. Welcome back to the podcast, author Bess Lovejoy. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Excited to be back.
You had previously joined us and talked about a number of things, all associated with the macabre. And you actually said something pretty funny when we were joining on this particular recording. You had said that, did you say Monday morning in the fall is a busy time for a professional goth?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, the fall scramble. Yeah, it's the time of year where I suddenly become relevant because all of the spooky stories and local history that I'm sort of interested in all the time becomes seasonally appropriate. It actually becomes seasonally appropriate, I think, starting around mid-July. People start thinking about what's going to be good to have running in October. So suddenly all the stories about cemeteries and death that I want to write, people are actually excited about. I think we should have those stories all year round, but not everyone agrees.
Yeah, I was just going to say that. All year round should be fine. I mean, there's no better way to get you through the winter, especially if you're in a climate that has snow and you're sort of snowed in. There's really no other way to pass time than like spooky stories.
Well, there is that whole British tradition that we don't have here about telling ghost stories over Christmas. It's a big way of celebrating Christmas, which I wish we had over here. I might like Christmas a little bit more if we told ghost stories.
Well, we're going to make it a mission here on Crawlspace. All the listeners, this is where we're starting it. We're doing the British thing. We're going to get together and gather around the fire and tell some Christmas ghost stories this Christmas.
You heard it here first. Yes, I love it.
I love that about A Christmas Carol, the story, that it's really actually a ghost story, and some versions can even be spooky depending on how they portray the ghosts, which I love. So, but can you tell us a little bit about your works? You wrote a book called Rest in Pieces. I know we discussed this last time, but can you refresh our listeners' memories?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I wrote a book. It came out so long ago now, 2013. It's called Rest in Pieces, The Curious Fates of Famous Corpses. And it's about the posthumous adventures of, I think, about 50 dead bodies throughout history. So the oldest one is Alexander the Great and what happened after he passed away and the fight over his corpse. And then I think the most recent one at that time, the most recent death was Osama bin Laden and his burial at sea. So it kind of talks about all of the different tensions that arise after a famous person dies and the fights that often erupt among family, friends, fans, political devotees, regimes about how that person should be remembered, particularly what to do with their body, what kind of memorial to create. And it also goes into, the last wishes of all of these famous figures and whether they were actually carried out, which was kind of the seed of the book. I wanted to know what people's last wishes were. Like Michelangelo, what did he want for his funeral? But then when I started digging in, I discovered how often those last wishes weren't carried out, and how shambolic, to use a British term, a lot of those stories became.
Well, since that conversation, I was thinking about my wishes and decided that I want my body to be ground up into like a ground beef style and packaged in the form of hot dogs to be served at Yankee Stadium.
Are you very connected to Yankee Stadium? Is that the thing?
No, not really. I just
Okay.
figured that would be a good place to have a practical
Yeah.
joke with a few 100,000 people.
I think there might be some health and safety issues there, but it's good to have goals, It's good to have dreams.
If you're tricking the people who are buying these, hot dogs, then, you got to be tricking the food inspectors too, right?
Well, are we going to still have food inspections? Well, meat inspections are kind of going away now, right? So they're being defunded. So you might get away with it after all.
Good point.
That's what I'm saying,
Also,
right?
don't eat hot dogs. Yeah. Yeah, hot dogs are delicious, though. Not.
So you're saying that human flesh is delicious?
Well, I have not tasted human flesh. Like, I know some people think I'm pretty weird. I do draw the line at cannibalism. There's stories about people dipping ashes into tea and then someone taking a sip of that tea. I'm trying to remember the guy, Mausoleus. The word mausoleum comes from an ancient Greek ruler. And I believe that, if I'm remembering this correctly, which again, Monday morning, I might not be, but there's a story that his widow took some of his cremated ashes and into her wine in that case. I might have a sip of wine or tea that had ash, one sip, but no, I have I have never tasted human flesh. Wow. I can't believe I'm actually saying that on air. Yes, but hot dogs really grossed me out as a kid. I never wanted to eat them because I kind of just had it, like, I knew the meat was suspicious. But then when I lived in New York City, they're on every corner, and you have to, I'm sorry, vegetarians, but you have to have a hot dog just like sometimes when you live in New York.
Yeah, and they are tasty. Yeah, mystery meat though, for sure.
At least it's not like scrapple like they have in New York or in Philadelphia, where it's just like all those pungent spices covering up kind of decayed meat. But anyway, moving on from hot dogs. Yes.
So yeah, we were going to speak today about the Lone Fir Cemetery and a bit about Emma Merlotin. Can you tell us a bit about these subjects?
Yeah, I love Lone Fir. So Lone Fir, in case listeners are not familiar, is a cemetery in Portland, Oregon. It's one of the city's oldest cemeteries, and it's also an arboretum. It's filled with beautiful trees. I think it's the city's second largest arboretum. If anyone is in the Pacific Northwest and hasn't visited, I highly recommend visiting because it's full of just like beautiful historic graves and a lot of ghost stories. And one of the most frequently told ghost stories is about this woman, Emma Merlotin, who was a sex worker. She's referred to as a beautiful French courtesan. She did originally come from France. The name on her gravestone is Anne Tingley Lacaz. Tingry Lacaz. Actually, it's funny, Find a Grave has it slightly wrong. So it's Anne Jean Tingry Lacaz. So if you go to Lone Fir and look for her grave, don't look for Emma Merlotin, look for Anne Tingry Lacaz. She moved to Portland with her family when she was a young woman, and then this part of the story is a little unclear, but the story goes she married a wealthy man and her husband left her. He ran off to New York with another woman. So she was left alone in Portland. And this is around the 1880s, early 1880s. And women at that time did not have a ton of ways to make money. And so she decided to become a prostitute, a fairly high-class prostitute, as the story goes. But then this horrible crime unfolded. I think it was December 22nd, 1885. It was a very cold night, and I read the account from the next day in the Oregonian newspaper, and the story goes that this young man comes running up to a police officer, and Emma, or Anne's neighbor, had come to find him because she had gone to check on her friend. Apparently they would have dinner together every night, and discovered this horrible scene. And when the police showed up, they found, I'm just going to call her Emma because she's known as Emma. They found Emma in a 3-foot wide pool of blood, lying face down on the floor. Her head was partly underneath the bed. She was only wearing her slip, her chemise, and her boots, and she was covered in gash wounds. I think there was 12 wounds in the report, any 9 of which could have been fatal, and they seem to have been made with a hatchet. And they tried some emergency procedures on her, but she was very much dead. I mean, obviously, any death like this is tragic, but she was very beloved in the neighborhood. She was known for her charity works. She gave away a lot of money to the poor, and she frequently gave food to beggars and also lodgings to beggars. Well, there's, I guess, 3 fascinating things to the story. One is that no one was ever charged with the crime. They did arrest a suspect, I want to say a Finnish sailor, the next day who had been seen hanging around the crime scene, reportedly with a hatchet and bloodstains, but they never charged him. There were some other confessions that came along in later years by men who were arrested for killing other women, and they said, "Oh yeah, I did Emma as well." But the police never quite bought it, and I don't know all of the details there. I'm not sure anyone has done a full investigation into this crime. I would love to know if any of your readers want to, tell me otherwise. But as far as I can figure out, there was not ever anyone charged. There certainly wasn't anyone ever put in jail for this. There's some suggestion that her murderer may have been one of her wealthy clients, and there might have been a bit of a cover up. That might have been why no one was ever arrested for the crime. But part of what got reported in the newspapers, and seems to be true, is that one of her eyes was actually removed in an attempt to try to find her killer. Strangely enough, they gave this eye to a local photographer because there was an idea at the time. It's called forensic optography. The idea was that, and some of your listeners might be familiar with this, the eye, the retina, records an image of the last thing a person saw before death. And there is a grain of truth to that, which I can get to in a minute. But the idea was that if you removed someone's retina, you could, I'm not sure exactly how it was supposed to work, but you could develop an image from that would show the murderer. And that was how to find the killer. Interestingly, the Oregonian reports that this was done, that one of her eyes was removed. But they basically say, like, this is bunk. This is not going to work. We don't really know why the police did it. So it was a suspected idea even from the beginning. It's interesting, though, because there were some horrible experiments done with rabbits and frogs where they basically paralyze them, show them a high contrast image, bright against a dark background or reverse, dissect the eye, and do find a version of this image. But it seems to only work if the creature has been staring at this image for a very long time and it's very high contrast, and then you need to remove the eye immediately after death. So it's very difficult to know whether that would actually work with humans. It's funny, a lot of places will say this idea of forensic optography has been thoroughly debunked, but there is kind of a seed of truth in it. And there was one experiment that this German guy did with a condemned criminal where he was able to actually take the eye from this individual right after death. What he said, according to his scientific report, he was able to get an image from the guy's eye. It was reported as looking like a fez hat with 2 bites out of it. Some people say it was the guillotine that went down on this guy's head, which doesn't make sense because he wouldn't really have seen the guillotine. Other people say it actually was the steps that this man climbed right before death. Regardless, this has never actually been used to find anyone's killer. Although it's funny, I was listening to a report on this that mentioned that it has been used to tease out confessions from people. The police basically saying, "Hey, we know you did it because we have an image from the person's eye," and the killer then confessing. Anyway, they removed her eyes. They removed one of her eyes. That's part of why we remember the story. But also she is a ghost that's supposed to haunt the cemetery. There's stories that she appears. There's stories that someone is wandering the cemetery at night in French fashions, a high-class lady, a beautiful lady. And when people see her, she throws up her hands, she screams, and she disappears. And the idea is that she might be reliving the night of her death. So that's Emma.
I got a couple questions.
Okay.
One of them is the experiments that they did with the frogs and the other animals. Did those actually work? Because you kind of said that they saw something there.
Yeah. No, when I've read up about it, it's the kind of thing where it's like, it's hard to reproduce these experiments. But according to the scientific reports that these men, it was a German fellow, I think, who did most of them. He said, yes, I was able to get an image from like this rabbit's eye or this frog's eye. And there is an image, you can find it around online. It's pretty awful actually, because this guy was like forcing rabbits to stare at a really bright window and then decapitating them and dissecting their eyes. But he did get an image of what appears to be a window, like a reflection of a window. I'm not an expert on the science of the eye or vision. Part of what prompted this interest is there is a pigment in the back of the eye in humans that is, I believe, it's bright in darkness, and then you go out into light and it fades, and it's known as photobleaching, this pigment. And so the discovery of this, and again, I'm not an expert, but the discovery that this happens in the human eye around the same time that photography is getting really popular, so latter half of the 19th century, caused some scientists to think maybe there is a way to actually find images in the human eye. And from what I'm reading, it stands to reason that you could get, if you fix someone's eye on a high contrast thing, I mean, there's all kinds of ethical issues here, but if you fix their eye on something and dissected it in a dark room immediately after death, you might get some version of a high contrast image, but you would never be able to get a human face. You would never be able to get details that would work well enough to identify someone's face. But I know it's very strange to think, I mean, it blew my mind to think that there's anything that gets recorded in a retina, but apparently, at least in these cases with frogs and rabbits, they were able to get some kind of an image.
Okay, just one more question on that. Like the mechanics of that, did they remove the retina and then look at it in a microscope and then take like early form of a photo?
Yeah. I don't know. I don't fully understand exactly how they did that part, but the idea is they did remove the retina and then do some kind of an examination on it that produced the image. I don't have the kind of mechanical brain that understands that sort of thing very well, and I think you would need to understand more about the actual anatomy of the eye than I currently understand. But the idea is that the retina was able to produce this image. What I find really fascinating too is that they were giving it to photographers to produce the image. But if listeners are interested, if you Google forensic optography, there's a great, and by the way, optography means writing of the eye. There's a really interesting article that McGill University in Canada wrote about this. I think it's called I Spy, Back of My Eye, Murder or Not. They don't mention Emma, but it's an essay about this idea in general. McGill runs a lot of really fascinating articles debunking pseudoscience, sort of looking at different issues and is this a pseudoscience or not? And it's interesting because it is a pseudoscience to say this technique can be used to identify a murderer, but it's not entirely pseudoscience to think that something is recorded in the eye. Fascinatingly enough.
Well, I've changed my last my wishes for my for what to do upon my death. I need my eye to be removed and I need the retina to be examined because I'm positive we'll see an image of Tim eating a hot dog.
He needs to stand in front of a bright window. You need to do like one of those competitive eating things and just eat hot dog after hot dog in front of a bright window, and then it may work.
Well, that's like Tuesday nights for me.
And me.
Now I'm hungry for a hot dog. I need lunch.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor.
And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
So what about the ghost stories of Emma? These sightings, you said she kind of runs away, I guess screams and runs away. Does she have both of her eyes in this scenario? And is this like a frightening encounter for people?
Yeah. It is reported to be frightening. I wondered about the eye thing too. In the reports that I've read in like the ghost folklore books, no one mentions her eyes in the ghost image. A lot of these sightings are said to be at night, and so things are kind of blurry. I don't know that people are getting like an extremely good look at her face. And in fact, not everyone who sees this would necessarily know that it's Emma. They're just seeing a woman who's supposed to be dressed in high-class French fashion. I wonder how it was that she was wearing French fashion many years after leaving France, but I suppose that was if it's true that she was making a lot of money and that was the fanciest style of the time. I also wonder how people are able to know that it's French fashion these days just by looking at it. But this is the way ghost stories work. They're not necessarily extremely rooted in the truth. They're just part of how we remember the dead in some way.
And this was in 1889, right? 1888?
It's 1885 that she dies.
I think 1888 was in my head because I was just like thinking maybe there was a Jack the Ripper connection. Has that ever been explored?
It's really funny that you mentioned that because Jack the Ripper showed up twice when I was looking into this. One is that apparently the area where she died, and this is confusing to me because supposedly she made a lot of money, but supposedly the area where she died was so rife with crime that within a couple of years, it began to be called Whitechapel after the area where Jack the Ripper did his work. And then interestingly, Jack the Ripper's one of his last victims, I think actually his last victim also had her retina dissected in an attempt to find the killer. So there is a connection there. But I mean, there's a connection in terms of that technique. I don't know that anyone has suggested that, the killer is linked in any way, but definitely Jack the Ripper gets talked about a lot within a couple years when people are reporting on this story.
Was there any sort of autopsy done? Was she perhaps pregnant?
Oh, that's a really good question. I did not see. There was a coroner's inquest. I didn't see the follow-up on that. The murder gets reported about a lot. Anything subsequently is not really reported on. So I haven't had a chance to actually go down to Portland and look into it more deeply, but I'm not certain if there was an autopsy. I've never seen a report that she was pregnant. There was a thought that she might have been robbed because it was Christmas time or nearly Christmas time. And her neighbor, the one who initially found her, said that she had saved up a bunch of money that she was going to use to buy Christmas presents. And so there's some thought that someone came in to rob her. But it's really unclear whether that may have happened because they searched and they didn't find any money in her house, which could mean the money was taken, but also no one really knew where to look for her money. It wasn't in the bank. She would have hid it somewhere in her house. So it's possible they just did not find her hiding place. But that's the suggestion that I've seen rather than pregnancy, is that potentially the motive was just robbery. The rest of the house was not ransacked in any way, though.
Interesting. And they never found the money in the house.
No. But, when I was reading this, I thought, I hate to say it, but she was known for letting beggars in and providing food and lodgings to people. It's possible that she let in someone that she should not have.
Now, what about other spirits at this cemetery? Is it widely haunted by many apparitions?
There's a lot of reports of various kinds of ghosts and just weird feelings that people have roaming around Lone Fir. There's some reports that people have seen sort of like zombie-like figures roaming around, which is really strange to me. Culturally, we don't have like a zombie legacy necessarily in this part of the world. But maybe people have watched too many horror movies. Just sort of seeing these, just like zombie-like figures walking around. People have seen all kinds of strange stuff there. One thing that I love, there's something that is kind of like an art installation right outside Lone Fir. It's called a ghost brush. It's like, I'm trying to think of how to describe it. It almost looks like one of those stands where you would get like an electric scooter. And it says, it's basically, it sort of plays on the idea of like bringing an invasive species out of a protected place on your shoe. And the idea is like you might have a ghost attached to your shoe. So use this wire brush cleaner to brush any ghosts off your shoe so that you don't like track them through the rest of Portland. It's a very Portland idea. Portland, I don't know if anyone has seen Portlandia. Portland is a very quirky place that I love it. I think maybe there's more of an openness to some of these ideas than there would be in other parts of the country. I've never seen any kind of ghost brush installation anywhere else.
Can you elaborate a little bit on the zombies that people see? Do they disappear, or is it like something in the distance that people aren't sure of and then they get closer and they're gone? Or how does this work?
There's some reports that the men scream, these sort of zombified men who are kind of like shuffling around, and then when people see them, they scream. It's also very weird. I don't know why there's so much screaming in Lone Fir Cemetery. The whole, all of Oregon is full of crazy ghost stories. But I did want to mention there's a couple of other really interesting burials in Lone Fir, not all of which have ghost stories attached to them, but they're very strange. There's this guy named Michael Mitchell. He was a jig dancer, which I guess that was a profession in the 19th century, who apparently got drunk one night and froze to death. And he has a headstone that says, "Here lies one who has taken steps that won the applause of man, but grim death came and took a step which he could not withstand." So that's kind of just like a fascinating tombstone. I don't know if he is said to haunt the cemetery, but there's also a grave that has a Scrabble board embedded in it, which I've never seen anywhere else. I guess the deceased loved Scrabble. So that's a really fun thing to go and see.
You have this concept of graveyard etiquette. And I think that's a really wonderful concept because you want to make sure you're respectful of the area and the land, and anybody who goes there needs to understand how sort of sacred it is. Is there some sort of etiquette that you need when you're looking for these zombies or these ghosts? Should you go in looking for them, I guess is my question. Is that outside the realm of etiquette?
It depends on what you're doing when you're looking for the ghosts. I mean, I think the thing to remember is that there are still burials in this cemetery. It's not an abandoned cemetery. There might be active burials happening. So, you can go in with a spirit of curiosity to see whatever you're going to see, but you need to be aware that there might be mourners nearby. And so if I don't know what you would do looking for zombies that would be particularly disruptive, but you need to not be disruptive. Just imagine basic empathy is a great concept that I encourage. So imagine if you were at a funeral and you saw people nearby, how would you want them to be behaving? I guess if you're going to go in with a boom box or a ton of equipment, or you're recording what you're doing and you're being extremely loud, you're laughing a lot, that would be inappropriate. That said, I think some of this is a little bit debatable because we have a modern concept of what is appropriate to do in a cemetery that is not always what was considered acceptable way back when. And so some people say don't ever eat in a cemetery. I actually think it's okay to sit on a bench and have your lunch. I think some cemeteries do prohibit this, but I have been known to have a picnic in a cemetery. That is something people used to do very frequently. And some of these dead, not to say that they have agency anymore, but when they died, they would have expected that people would have come and have had a picnic in their cemetery. It's not disrespectful to kind of just do a normal human thing, like eat a sandwich, but just, I would say, don't be loud, don't be disruptive, don't take anything from the cemetery. I mean, you could maybe take a feather or something, but certainly don't take any pieces of the headstones or anything that's ornamental there, and don't do grave rubbings because that's actually bad for the stones.
Or you'll get cursed.
Exactly. Either of these things could happen. It's too bad about the grave rubbings because I love the idea of that, but I mean, just these days everyone has a smartphone. Just take a photo with your phone and your photo may or may not be cursed, but you will be less likely to be cursed, I think.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor.
And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
Now, what about the ownership history of this cemetery? Are there any interesting stories there?
Well, I think the only interesting story there really is the reason behind the name Lone Fir. I'm forgetting the name of the pioneer family that was there originally, but it's full of trees now, but originally there was only one tree there. And so when the pioneer settlers started burying folks there, they wanted to bury them near the one tree, the Lone Fir, which is still there. You can go and find it. It's sort of in the back half of the cemetery. And I just love that the original tree is still there. But I think it was deeded to the city not all that long after those burials started. And it's funny, I'm in the process of researching this Seattle cemetery called Comet Lodge that has this extremely complicated history, but I don't think Lone Fir ever went through a period like a lot of American cemeteries have, or a lot of very old cemeteries in America. It was never abandoned, as far as I know, and it's under the care of the Friends of Lone Fir Cemetery right now, who do a really great job, and they have a lot of public events and engagement activities. It's really interesting. They're actually building a memorial there because one of the famous residents is James Hawthorne, he was the lead psychiatrist at, I want to say it was the Hawthorne Institute for the Insane. I might be remembering that slightly incorrectly, but it was one of the early mental asylums in the Portland area. He was a good guy. He was a kind and generous guy. And a lot of his patients were buried near him in unmarked graves. And then interestingly, that part of the cemetery was also where there were a lot of Chinese burials of Chinese folks. Unfortunately, the city took over, is that the city or the county took over that part of the cemetery and built an office building there without moving the graves. And that became very contentious years later. And so at the time, I think this happened in the 50s, that they just took over the land and built the office building on top. The office building is gone now. It's a vacant lot, Block 14, and they're actually building a very beautiful memorial there with, I think, multiple kinds of public art. There's a beautiful like archway that's going to happen, and then these community altars where they've involved the local Chinese American community to talk to them about what sort of remembrance they would want to have there for the Chinese ancestors that remain on the site. And then interestingly, a lot of the mental asylum patients who were buried there, they did find a bunch of them, not quite in Block 14 where they thought they were, but in another block, Block 10, and they have put up new tombstones. So not all of them are in unmarked graves anymore. That's all just within the last year that I believe that those tombstones have gone up and they finally made progress on the memorial. So again, this is an active place. This is not an abandoned place. There's new burials, there's new memorials, there's community engagement at the same time as it has this beautiful 19th century air. So it's a really fascinating place in that it has kind of both those aspects going on.
I was just looking at a list of the notable names buried in Lone Fir, and there's a gentleman by the name of Asa Lawrence Lovejoy. Is this a relation?
No, the Portland Lovejoys are not related to me, according to my dad, according to what I can figure. It's a different branch of the Lovejoy family. But I like to pretend that's not the case. I don't know. When I go there, I always feel like I should be getting like a discount at the coffee shop or something for like having the last name Lovejoy. I even like have gone to Lovejoy Street. There's a restaurant called the Lovejoy Corral where, I joke that's where we have our family shootouts. And yeah, I like going there as a Lovejoy, but I don't think we're actually related, sadly.
Now, what about this woman, Charity Lamb? Do you know about this lady who killed her husband with an axe?
Yeah, I don't know a lot of details. I just know she's a very early female, murderess. And she has such a great name. But the weird thing is we don't know where her burial site is, which is maybe for the best. The story with her is that her husband was actually abusive, and she was the first woman sentenced to the state penitentiary. And then I think she went to the insane asylum. I don't know if it was Hawthorne's insane asylum, but I think it was. And she lived in the insane asylum for about 50 years, and then she's somewhere in Lone Fir, but her grave is not marked. And sometimes that'll happen if it's a very how can I say, contentious grave. Because people don't necessarily want there to be, abusive activity in the cemetery or that kind of, I don't know, people don't, they think there might be some level of disrespect going on.
I'd love to get back to Emma for a moment and talk about her murder with the hatchet. So she was murdered with the hatchet.
They think it was a hatchet. They never found the murder weapon, but yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay. So they never found the murder weapon, but the wounds were consistent with that of a hatchet.
Hatchety, yeah.
Hatchety wounds. Were there any other attacks or any other known murders that had similar outcomes, similar MO?
I think that there were. I'm not an expert on Portland history at that time, but from the little that I've read, there were definitely other murders of sex workers and women in that area. I don't think it was the kind of thing where it was clearly the same killer at work. You know what I mean? I think that there was I haven't seen any reference to that, but I think that over the years in that Whitechapel area, there were other murders that could have been done by a hatchet. And interestingly, part of why they think it was a hatchet, I love the specificity of this. They found 2 rings that she was wearing, 2, I think, gold rings. One had a cameo and it come off, but the other had a chip in it. Her hand was also cut where the chip was. And it was such they could tell from the way that chip had been made and the type of wound that she had on her finger that it was a hatchet. I guess it was very sharp, but not sharp in the way that a knife would be. So it seems like there was actually some decent forensic work. They did remove her retina. But the thing is, you have to remember that at that time, just to get back to the retina thing for a second, it's so easy to make fun of our ancestors, but they were trying to figure things out, right? Photography was relatively new. It sort of made sense to them to experiment however they could to find this to find this person's killer.
We covered a case out of New Hampshire that occurred after the time period that we're talking about. And there was a guy who came into that case who claimed he could solve it by taking a photograph of the blood and then developing the photograph and then looking at the photograph closely with a magnifying glass. And then if you look closely enough, that would actually reveal the face of the killer.
Wow. What era was this? What year?
1918.
Yeah, that seems very bizarre.
Yeah, it didn't work.
I mean, again, I guess they're trying to develop forensic science and experiment. I mean, to me, that sounds insane. Perhaps there was some kernel of truth in the way there is with this retina thing. I mean, we learn a lot from blood these days, just not by taking flash photos. Was the idea that you could see an image of the murderer? So it's not like DNA or anything like that. Yeah, they didn't have. Yeah.
Yeah, it was sort of like the last image that was embedded in this victim's subconscious, right? So very similar to the retina, the last impression. So I think he even said like he could make out like rough faces or profiles or something. But honestly, like this is blood that was on a wood surface. And you could really kind of make up anything if you're looking at it close enough.
Yeah. Well, it makes me think, too, this is only sort of related, but I don't know if you guys are familiar with maternal impression theory. It's this idea that, like, if a woman is frightened by something while she's pregnant, or if a pregnant person is frightened by something, then the baby can be born looking like whatever the person was frightened by. So, a woman goes to the zoo, she's frightened by an ape or something, her baby will turn out looking like an ape. It was a really widespread idea, not a scientific idea, I should say, but it was a popular idea in the 19th century and maybe even earlier. So I don't know, I think maybe our ancestors were, confused about this idea about how images got recorded. But again, it makes sense if you think about early photography. If you look at some of those early images, like the first, daguerreotype and stuff, they're sort of so ghostly on their own. I can see people being kind of unnerved by photography and the possibilities of that and sort of wondering, well, how else are images recorded? How else does this work, Because people didn't quite understand it. We still don't understand it. I mean, I don't understand it. Other people understand it. But if you ask me, how is a photo developed? I don't know that I could take you through that process in detail, but I do it on my phone 20 times a day. I take a photo.
Can you tell us a little bit about the cemetery in Seattle that you're researching now?
Sure. Yeah, I actually have to go back there in just a little bit. It's really interesting. So there's a place called Comet Lodge Cemetery, and it's in Beacon Hill, but it used to be considered part of Georgetown, which was Seattle's, kind of our red light district for a long time. And it was initially a whole separate city. It wasn't actually part of Seattle. And Comet Lodge was founded, I think it was 1895, and it was named for the fraternal organization, Comet Lodge. And it was a burial site for Seattle area or Georgetown pioneers. It's often said to have been a Duwamish burial site before that. I'm actually meeting a member of the Duwamish tribe there, and one of the things I want to ask him about is there any truth to the idea that this was a native burial ground? Because a lot of places are reported as native burial grounds, but it's not always clear if that's true. It's particularly interesting in this case, too, because the Duwamish here, and there's many different native nations that are in the Seattle area, but the Duwamish were on the land that sort of like most of Seattle is on, if I understand this correctly. And they actually did not bury their dead in the ground. They practiced tree burial. They put them up in the trees. So all of these reports about it being, Comet Lodge being an ancient Indian burial ground, well, if anything like that was going on, they were in the trees. They were not in the earth. They may have eventually fallen into the earth, but I think the bones were then taken away and decayed in some way. Anyway, but it's a very confusing place because a lot of the titles there are very clouded. Like Comet Lodge runs the cemetery for a while in the very early 20th century, and then Comet Lodge joins with another lodge, disbands. The cemetery is briefly sold, but then it's abandoned for the bulk of the 20th century. And the stories there are that, and I want to flag that this is just a story, the northern half of the cemetery was sold. That part is true. The story is that the part of the cemetery that was sold was where child burials happened. It was known as baby land, and many cemeteries had a baby land where infants and children were buried. The story here is that part of the cemetery was sold. Houses were built on top of baby land. A lot of ghostly activity then began. And so there's stories about, well, people seeing little ghost children in the cemetery, but also people in those houses having strange experiences. Like one woman, she collected porcelain dolls, like valuable antique dolls, and she had them in a locked case, a beautiful like glass display case, and she would lock it every night. But she would frequently come down in the morning to find the case unlocked and the dolls scattered about in her house as though they had been played with. There's also a story of a little boy who was frequently being chastised by his parents for leaving his toys around. He kept saying, like, it's not me, I'm not doing it. And you know how little kids can be. His parents were like, yeah, no, it's you. But then eventually he told his parents, and I don't know if he was just an imaginative kid trying to like place the blame on someone else. He's like, no, there's this other little boy. He's older than me. He's in like weird old fashioned clothing. And he comes at night and he plays with my toys. And he's the one leaving the toys around. It's not me. But it's interesting because these stories seem to crop up around the 1950s, and then you hear them sort of periodically ever since then. And when I went to the cemetery yesterday, I visited with a historian who works now at our museum of Mohi down on the waterfront. And when we visited, there were actually like someone had left toys on the graves, like little dolls and little stuffed toys. And I've been there a lot. I've never seen it before. It's very creepy to see little stuffed toys all around the cemetery. And my thought was, is someone leaving these toys for the ghost children to play with? When I spoke to this historian, her name is Michaela Woodward, she mentioned that some of these earliest stories about little kid ghosts in the cemetery start from other kids playing in the cemetery in the 50s. So it may have been sort of their attempt to make sense of death, or to sort of come to terms with this idea that this place where they're playing, because it was abandoned at that point, was actually a burial ground. But there's something about kid ghosts that's just always the creepiest as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, they could literally be doing nothing and just standing there, and they're way creepier than like a zombie or something like that.
Yeah, I have to say I've never been in that cemetery, but it has the weirdest offerings of any place I've ever been to. The weirdest stuff left on the graves, but the toys are definitely up there.
Okay, so just to wrap this up here, we are talking about an unsolved murder, or we talked about an unsolved murder 140 years ago. Do you think that Emma's murder will ever be solved?
Oh, that's a great question. I think it would be great. I mean, probably not. I don't think it will ever be solved, but it would be great if someone, and perhaps someone is doing this, took more of a look at these crimes against sex workers that happened in the Whitechapel area, and maybe looked more, in more depth at the different types of crimes and whether they could be connected and why they were allowed to happen, and whether there was any sort of like anything that could have been done better to protect the woman at that time. And it's also worth thinking about why we still talk about these stories and how we can talk about them responsibly. I worry, like, I don't want people to be profiting off of murdered sex worker stories. You know what I mean? Like, we need to remember that these were real humans who worked and who suffered.